Welcome to All Those Kings, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. We're going to be talking about the kings for about 8 weeks. And we're going to be approaching this as a history class. I know history was one of your favorites in high school. I think history and math are regarded as the two least favorite classes. But if we do not look at the Bible as a book of history, it completely disqualifies our faith. For example, God gave us rules at Mount Sinai. The conventional wisdom today, as presented by what are referred to as liberal scholars, as well as the secular world, is that there was no giving of the law at Mount Sinai. It's a fiction that was created in Babylon hundreds of years later. If that's the case, the primary result of that is that our Bible's completely disqualified because the laws that were given to us at Mount Sinai, the rules that we use to interact with the Lord, are man-made, made up by a group of people in Babylon. They thought it was a good way to live, and I would agree with that, but they have no moral authority. They have no moral authority whatsoever, and they have no more authority than perhaps the rules for behavior that we see in Hitler's Mein Kampf. I mean, we breed horses, we breed cattle, we breed sheep. Why not breed human beings? Those are equally good moral laws if we didn't get the laws at Mount Sinai. If we didn't get the laws at Mount Sinai, if there was no Passover, Jesus is a liar and a fraud. He celebrated Passover. He talked about Moses. He talked about the kings. If these were not real people, if these were not real events, then the Bible, as a book of history, is fraudulent, and so is our faith. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at one section of the Bible. We're going to look at the kings, and we're going to focus primarily on the first 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. They're the most fun anyway. But we're going to focus on those 3 for the next several weeks, and I'm going to be showing you the historical underpinning, the archaeology, the cultural backgrounds. We'll talk about the stories in depth, and we'll have some fun with it, but these were real people. They were 3 failed men. Saul failed terribly and was removed from the throne. He died. David failed terribly. He redeemed himself. Solomon, I think, was the biggest betrayer of all. He was given wealth. He was given fame. He was given wisdom. He built the temple, and then he betrayed God by becoming a pagan worshiper at the end of his life. And the church kind of, I think, either ignores that or overlooks it because it doesn't fit with the image of Solomon as one of the greatest. But we'll talk about him as well. And then we'll take a look at a few of the other kings along the way. So anyway, if we're going to talk about the first king, King Saul, we can't just say all of a sudden, King Saul took the throne sometime around 1052 BC, and he ruled for maybe 42 years, we're not quite sure. And then when he died, David took the throne. That's the way they teach history, or at least they did to me when I was in high school. What we're going to do is try to understand why these things happened. The question you have to ask about Saul is why? Why did they ask for a king? The Israelites had been living in the Holy Land for more than 200 years as independent tribal groups. They helped each other out from time to time, but basically they were living as independent tribal groups. And then all of a sudden, they asked Samuel to give them a king. And the question is why? What was the change? What happened? So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's take a look, first of all, about the origin of the Israelites. This is a map of the eastern end of the Mediterranean. This is from Google Earth. The Israelites grew up in a land that was split by what you can see as a red line there. That's known as the Great Rift. There's a huge crack in the earth. That's the deepest place on the face of the earth. The Dead Sea is the lowest place on the face of the earth. It's about 1,200 feet below sea level. That narrow valley, the rift, is only a couple of miles wide at the northern end, and it widens out to about 15 miles down near the Dead Sea. But this is the land in which the Bible takes place. The Israelites, as a group of people, traveled to Egypt and ended up in Goshen at the time of Joseph and Jacob. The Israelites at that time, the tribe, so named because Jacob had been given the name of Israel. Remember that? He wrestled with a being and was given a new name, Israel. His descendants were the Israelites. his children, his grandchildren, and so forth. When they went to Egypt, it was a group of perhaps 200 or 300 people. We were given the names of Jacob and his sons and his grandsons, plus wives and daughters and servants and so forth. And I would argue that it's a group of perhaps 300 or 400 people at the maximum. In other words, a large migrating tribe of Semites went into Egypt. After many generations, they had become a large enough population to be removed, led by Moses. They traveled around in the desert for about 40 years and ended up at a place called Kadesh, which you can see on the map there. We don't know exactly where that was, but it was in the Negev someplace. And then they were ready for their invasion, their attack into the Holy Land. They traveled around Edom because they weren't allowed to pass through Edom, which was located at the southern end of the Dead Sea. Located themselves in a place called the Plains of Moab, right at the north end of the Dead Sea. And then they went in and took control of the Holy Land, fighting various Canaanite groups for the right to remain. They didn't occupy the cities. They simply wanted the right to remain as semi-nomads wandering around on the fringes of society with their flocks grazing out on the edges of the cultivated land, and they did that for a couple of hundred years. In Deuteronomy, we see this repeatedly. They are told who's there. When you go into the land, you're going to have to fight some people. There are some people that already occupy the land. There were many big Canaanite cities down along the coast. But it says, the Lord your God will drive out before you many nations, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. These are all subgroupings of Canaanite groups. Canaan is a generic name like America. We're all Americans. We're Floridians. Some of us are even Texans. Figure that. But anyway, that's what these various groups are. They're various subgroupings of Canaanites. And the Lord said, here's the land that you're going to get. This is in Numbers. He says, when you get there, the land that will be allotted to you will have these boundaries. He starts off by saying your southern boundary will start from the end of the Salt Sea, which is the Dead Sea. Your western boundary will be the coast of the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean. Your northern boundary, and it says you go from this mountain to this valley to this river, and we can follow that out today. Still, the geography is the same. It's real. It's accurate. And then it gives you an eastern boundary as well. So if you draw that out on a map, this is basically the land that the Lord said we're going to be giving to you folks. There's a northern boundary and an eastern boundary. Notice it runs down the Great Rift for most of its distance. After they conquered the land, Joshua said, okay, come on over, bring your leaders here, we're going to throw lots. And we don't quite know what lots are. They use the Urim and Thummim, whatever those were. We don't know what those were. It's something perhaps like throwing dice. In other words, some kind of a lottery type arrangement where you would be able to pick the land that you want. And these are the various tribal allotments. Notice that 3 of the tribes on the eastern side are outside the boundaries that were originally allotted. That's Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. They're called the Transjordanian tribes, and they were the ones that disappeared the quickest as time passed. Transjordan means on the other side of the Jordan River to the east. So we have 3 tribes to the east, and you have all the other various tribes, and they lived this way for 200 years. They helped each other out. They fought as a group when they had to, but basically they had no king. And the question is why, after 200 years of successful living, which would be somewhat like maybe the American colonies never having a federal government, we've been in existence for 200 years. I know there are probably some people who might argue that that's not such a bad idea, but anyway, you have all the tribes living separately for a long time, and then all of a sudden, they want to have a king. So let's take a look. After the conquest, we're told that after that whole generation, now these are the ones that came into Canaan, fought the Canaanites, settled the various tribal allotments, and then died. So we're looking at 40 or 50 years perhaps after the conquest. It said another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Now, that doesn't mean they weren't familiar with the faith or what had happened. It simply means they didn't acknowledge. They didn't acknowledge what God had done. They were falling away from the faith. That's what that terminology means. So we find that they're drifting into pagan behavior. They're being seduced by the pagan lifestyle that they see in the land. We have the same thing happening today to some degree, perhaps with the internet. We have a group of people that are being seduced by the various attractions of what's being offered to us on the internet. This is what happened to them. They fell away. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. And it goes on and it says they lived among the Canaanites. Now see, here are the same people again. It says the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage, which was forbidden, and gave their own daughters to their sons, which was forbidden, and served their gods, which was forbidden. All of this was forbidden when they were at Mount Sinai and in the desert. They were told, don't do this. Don't enter into that culture. So these various groups, Canaanites and so forth. Now, here's the question, and this is the answer to the question of why did they ask for a king? Who's missing? What group of people that are very prominent in this part of the Bible are not listed in this group? The Philistines, exactly. And this is one of those what we call cultural specificities. There are details in the Bible that tell us that are specific to a particular time or people or place. And if somebody puts that in the story, you have to argue that they knew what they were talking about because somebody much later couldn't make it up. There are details about the way they lived. The example that I use is if we read a sentence that says, Joe crossed the Mississippi River to his farm, when did that happen? We don't have a clue. It could be any time from when colonists started crossing the Mississippi. But if we said he crossed the bridge, now we know it can't be any earlier than the earliest bridge. If I said he drove his Model A across the bridge, now we know it has to be at least the early 1900s, although it could be yesterday if he has an antique car. But if I said he drove across the bridge in his Model A, and sat down at the desk and went on the internet to find out how to treat corn blight, we know it had to be later than 1980 because Al Gore invented the internet in 1980. Now, you see, that's cultural specificity. We are told that when they entered the land, there were no Philistines. We know who the Philistines were. We know where they came from. And so we know that the Israelite entry into the promised land happened prior to the arrival of the Philistines, and that's what the Bible tells us. Historically, it's correct. The numbers work, the dates work. That's cultural specificity. The Philistines. Okay, let's take a look. How do we know there were no Philistines in the land? Well, first of all, they're not listed, and then we have a whole series of battles between various Israelite tribes against Canaanites who were located in the land. Othniel, one of the first, he fought Arameans off in the east. Ehud, my favorite story, a left-handed soldier. I mean, it's a wonderful story. He goes in and he stabs a fat fellow who's so heavy that the sword gets stuck in his body. I mean, it's a wonderful story. Ehud fought Moabites, Ammonites, and Amalekites. Deborah fought Canaanites. Gideon fought Midianites over on the east side, as well as Amalekites and other eastern people. It's not until the time of Jephthah that we find the word Philistines appearing. This is much later in the time of the Judges. And then, of course, Samson. Samson fought the Philistines. Wonderful story. So we know that the Philistines arrived late, and the question is, who were they and why? Let's take a look. If this is a map of the tribal allotments, most of the Israelites lived in the hill country. They were given permission to settle down there along the coast, but they couldn't because those are Canaanite-dominated areas, Canaanite cities. We were told that the Canaanites dominated the coast and the lowlands, which included the Great Rift. The Israelites lived in the hill country. They were semi-nomads for a couple of hundred years. They didn't start building cities until about 1100 BC. We would place the Exodus around 1400, the conquest sometime around 1350, and this isn't what you're going to see in your study Bibles, but the study Bibles are wrong. Dr. Steve Collins, with his excavation of Sodom at Tal el-Hammam, is changing the chronologies based upon hard archaeological evidence. But at any rate, they lived in the hill country and didn't start building houses till about 1100 BC. They started building Israelite towns up in the hill country. Now, the reason that the Canaanites lived down on the coast in their big cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Beit Shan, Megiddo, Hatzor, all of these big Canaanite cities were located on the trade route, which went up the coast because it was much more convenient to travel along the coast than to try to climb up into the hills. And when the Philistines came to town, they took over the lower portion of the coastal region, and that became the land of the Philistines. So the question is, who were they? Where'd they come from? And this is kind of fun. This is a major archaeological and historical conundrum. Around 1200 BC, the world laid out this way. We have Canaan, a tiny little country about 40 miles wide with desert on one side, the Mediterranean on the other, and everything in the ancient world had to funnel through this tiny little strip of land. And we have, of course, major Mesopotamian cultures over in what would be modern Iraq today and Syria. We have the Egyptian culture that had been there since about 3000 BC, and major cultures up in what is called Turkey today, Anatolia, and all of these groups were contesting for the Holy Land because they would control the trade routes, and that's why all the battles in the Bible are fought in Canaan. That's what they wanted to control. Something happened around 1200 BC. The archaeologists don't know why. They ignore it. There have been only 2 books written on it in the last 30 years. It's a major event. It's called the end of the Bronze Age. Iron began to appear. Bronze kind of faded out, but everything collapsed for a couple of hundred years at about this point. The Mesopotamian culture deteriorated and was no longer to extend its influence. The Egyptians, same problem. Their hegemony disappeared. The Anatolian cultures, which at this time were called Hittites, were literally burned down to the ground and disappeared from history until 1900 AD. Scholars in 1900 AD said there never were any Hittites. It was so severely destroyed, nobody had any notion that there were ruins up there until about 1900. That allowed the Canaanites to have a short time in the sun. We have all these tiny little kingdoms, Edomites, Moabites, Arameans, Ammonites, Philistines, well, not the Philistines yet, Phoenicians, and most importantly, the Israelites. So we have all these tiny little kingdoms having a chance to contend with themselves, and they do so in the Bible. They're constantly fighting back and forth. The kingdom of Moab, about the size of Sarasota County, 20 miles wide in the livable space, tiny little kingdoms fighting back and forth over who gets this piece of land or that. That all changed with the arrival of the Philistines. The Philistines, it turns out, came from the Aegean. Up in that area, we have, at the same time, at the time of the Judges, we have a culture up in the Aegean known as Mycenaean or Mycenaean. Who's this? Iliad the Odyssey, Agamemnon. That's these people. Helen of Troy, that was much earlier, but these people are controlling the Aegean, and about the same time that everything else collapsed, that area collapsed as well, militarily, and the people that lived there were driven out. They took to the sea, all of the various tribal groups up there, and we call them the Sea Peoples. And one group came over, took control of Cyprus, used that as a jumping off point, and eventually in the 1100s went down the coast, burned out all the Canaanite cities as they went, ended up on the shores of Egypt, right down there in the Delta area, where they fought an Egyptian king named Ramesses III. Now, this is not the Ramesses of the Ten Commandments, Yul Brynner. This is a guy that had the same name a few years later as a throne name, but he was a different king entirely. He stopped this group from entering Egypt, either fought them to a draw or destroyed them or turned them around, whatever. But the group went back up the coast and resettled all of the cities that they had just burned out. And we know them as the Philistines. So now they're showing up at the latter part of the time of the Judges. It's an entirely different culture. They're uncircumcised. Aegean people never were circumcised. They're repeatedly referred to as those uncircumcised men in the Bible. But the Philistines are an Aegean culture. We even have a picture of one of the sea battles. On this temple, you can see the relief that's there, and if you draw it, you can make out two boats attacking each other. One group is Egyptians, you can tell by the headdress and the weapons, and the other group is Philistines, and you can tell by the headdress and the weapons. And this was a major battle for Ramesses III for the rest of his life, telling the story of how he defeated this group that was trying to take over Egypt. If we look at it in Israel, here's a map of Israel from the south, looking up the Great Rift. As it turns out, the Israelites had come in from the east, crossed up into the hill country. They took control of the hill country, even though they had tribal allotments elsewhere. They just didn't go there. For example, the story of the Danites. We're told that they couldn't take control of their allotment, so they went up north and conquered the city of Laish, a peaceful city, sneak attack, destroyed the city, took it over, renamed it Dan. That's the northernmost city. So they didn't control the trade routes in the lower areas, and the land of the Israelites at this time is basically the hill country. The Philistines came down from the Aegean, eventually settled along the coast after burning out all the Canaanite cities. And so you have a group of aggressive people on the coast. You have Israelites spreading down into the foothills. You have the Philistines spreading eastward into the foothills, and it becomes inevitable that there's going to be conflict. And that's what appears towards the end of the book of Judges. We have the various cities of the Philistines, the so-called Pentapolis, and this will play a part next week when we talk about it. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. These were all Canaanite cities that were burned out and then rebuilt by the Philistines. Samson was born in the hill country, and the events that happened during the life of Samson take place about where you see on the map there. Apparently, the Philistines established hegemony over the Israelites. It was fairly peaceful, I would argue, early on. Maybe they exacted tribute or took taxes or so on, but it wasn't a military control for reasons that I'll show you in a minute. But in Judges, it says, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, I would argue that that's not 39 plus 1. 40 is a symbolic number. It probably means a generation or a long time or the fullness of time. We don't know exactly, but there are many cases where 40 is a symbolic number, and you can, if it's really 40, that's fine. I have no problem with it. But it means for a long time, the Philistines were in control of the Israelites. And we are then introduced to a major player in the book of Judges. It says, a certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites, an insignificant small tribe, had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. Now, this is a major theme in the Bible. The mothers of very important figures were all sterile and childless. This was regarded as a withholding of a gift from God, and the bearing of children was a gift from God. So these women are sterile and childless. And the angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, and the repeating of a statement is done for importance. You'll see something said 2 or 3 times in 2 or 3 sentences in a row. You are sterile and childless. We just read that in the previous verse. But you are going to conceive and have a son. Here are some other examples of childless women in the Bible. Sarah, who eventually was the mother of Isaac. Rachel, the mother of Joseph, and then eventually Benjamin. She died in childbirth. She was probably in her young 40s at that time, giving birth, second child on the road, in the dirt, in her young 40s, and she died in childbirth, which is very common in those days. The mother of Samson, she's unnamed, but she was sterile and childless. Hannah, the mother of Samuel. And then, of course, Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. These are all women who had no children, were advanced in years, and play a major role in delivering somebody who's going to be part of God's plan. So anyway, she's told the boy's to be a Nazirite, set apart from God at birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now, this deliverance is going to take a long time. David will finally literally conquer the Philistines. But Samson's going to set things in motion. A Nazirite, incidentally, is somebody who is dedicated to God, usually for a short time, sometimes only a month or so. And it's a decision made by the individual himself, kind of as a penance, perhaps. But he is declared to be a Nazirite from birth, which means he can't cut his hair, he's not supposed to drink wine. But nevertheless, Samson is going to begin the deliverance from the Philistines. The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Shimshon. We call him Samson, but his real name in Hebrew is Shimshon. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Machane Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. We know where he was. We know where these towns were. If we look at the map of Israel, we see various Philistine towns. This is the northern end of the Philistine territory, marked out in purple there along the coast. And Zorah, the town from which Samson sprang, is located right on the border of what would be Philistine-dominated territory, and literally a couple of miles away is a small town that plays a role in the story, a town called Timnah. Now, I would argue that the Philistines and the Israelites at this point had kind of an uneasy relationship, a truce, so to speak. It was not a confrontational arrangement because Samson went to Timnah, just right down the road, and he saw a young Philistine woman, and he said to his father and mother, "Get her for me as a wife." Now, obviously, the Philistines would not want an Israelite son-in-law if they were regarded as inferior or contemptible. And his mother wasn't real happy that he was going to marry a Philistine, but again, it was something that could be done. They even have the wedding playing out. So we get a sense that there was some kind of an uneasy but functional relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites. One of the most amazing things out of archaeology lately is that from various records and excavations at Zorah, we know what Samson looked like. Here he is. This is a reconstruction. He was a good-looking young man, obviously. Incidentally, that's Victor Mature. When my wife was a young woman, she was madly in love with him as the epitome of masculinity, I guess. And we also know, what was his wife's name? Delilah would be a good guess, but it's wrong. We don't know what her name was. She remains nameless, we are told about the wife. Delilah figures in the story later, but we've been able to reconstruct what she looked like as well, and here she was. That's Murder, She Wrote, for those of you that, if you can believe it. So anyway, what happened was in the wedding, it was a tragedy. He provided a riddle, again, a cultural specific detail. This was a game that was played widely. We have it in numerous ancient documents, the word games and the riddles. It was considered the height of intelligence and sophistication to be able to do that. He offered up a riddle. You remember the riddle about the lion and the honey? They couldn't solve the riddle. It said during the 7 days of the wedding feast, cultural specific. That's how long wedding feasts were. They gather, probably drink for 7 days. It was we have the same type of thing playing out with Jacob when he was given the wrong wife. Remember, he got Leah at the wedding feast rather than Rachel. So anyway, she was told, the wife, that if you can't get the answer for us, we're going to kill you and your father and burn up your household. So she managed to get the solution to the puzzle, to the riddle, gave it to the Philistines, who at the very last moment, at the end of the 7 days, told Samson what the wedding feast, or what the riddle was. In a rage, he left, and she was given to another man. He came back sometime later and said, "Where's my wife?" Found out she'd been remarried. And in a rage, he went out, we are told, he tied foxes together with torches on their tails. These terrified little animals went running out through the fields. And it says they burned up the shocks and standing grain, together with the vineyards and olive groves. Now, this is a terrible thing. Not only is he burning up the food that they need this fall, that they've just harvested, because that's the standing grain and the shocks, but he's burning up the vineyards and groves, and it's going to take years to try to redeem those groves and the vineyards. This was a terrible thing that he did, and it basically set off the conflicts that we see between the Israelites and the Philistines from that point forward. Now, the Bible right at that point said he led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines, and then, which is kind of a preview summary, and then it moves right into a story that began back after the wedding. In other words, you have to kind of jump around, but sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the Valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Now, what does that mean? Delicate, amorous, temptress. There can be various translations, any one of which would work. We know what she looked like. This is the Sorek Valley. This is, you can see Zorah, which is where Samson was born. We're looking west. The horizon is the Mediterranean. We're just about 10 miles from the Mediterranean here. That's the Sorek Valley, with Timnah just a couple of miles down the road, and we're standing on the ruin of Beit Shemesh, which is where the ark was returned after the Philistines captured it. We'll look at that next week. So this is where it all happened. You have Israelite cities coming right up to basically the border between Israel and the Philistine areas, and they have a fairly comfortable relationship early on that deteriorates dramatically, and Samson seems to have been one of the major contributors to that. They used Delilah. They gave her a tremendous reward, again, for getting the answer to his strength. He was a Nazirite, and once they found out how to deal with him, he was taken. She apparently got him drunk or whatever. He fell asleep. She cut his hair, had his hair cut by a man. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, took him to Gaza, and then set him to grinding in prison. And then we are told that they wanted to have a celebration to their God, and they were going to bring Samson out to entertain them. It says Samson reached towards two central pillars on which the temple stood. A Philistine temple has been excavated down in the Philistine areas. These are very small buildings, incidentally. But they had pillars in the center because they were wider than 20, 25 feet. How do you determine the width of a building? It's the span that you can use for the roof. And in those days, the biggest piece of building material that they could span with was about 20 or 25 feet, cedars of Lebanon. And so if you wanted to make a building wider than that, you'd put pillars in the center and put two spans. The temple that Solomon built was only 20 cubits wide, which is 30 feet. And I once asked Lane Rittmeyer, a major archaeologist, why was the major temple only 30 feet wide? He said that's the widest it could be with a single piece of timber, cedars of Lebanon. So these are small buildings, but they did indeed have a set of pillars in the center. They found this archaeologically, and they were within the span of a man's hands. So this story could very easily have taken place, and as a matter of fact, we've been able to reconstruct how it happened. Samson pushed with all his might. Down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. There were people on the roof as well. When he separated this, the building collapsed and many people died. And here's how it happened.
Strengthen me, O God. Strengthen me only this once. Run him through! My eyes have seen thy glory, O God. Now let me die with my enemies. Cut him down!
So anyway, we are then told that his brothers and families, his father's whole family, brought him back and they buried him in the tomb of Manoah, his father. He had led Israel for 20 years. His tomb is still there today. This is the tomb of, theoretically, the tomb of Samson that has been preserved and honored for, which would be, at this point, almost 3,000 years. So that started things off, and as you turn the page, you're moving into the time of Samuel the prophet, and major confrontations with the Philistines, and we will get into that next week because it is these conflicts with the Philistines that panic the Israelites and causes them to tell Samuel, we need a king. We need someone to lead us. Because in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. They had drifted to the Baals. They were being attacked by the Philistines. And we will see the arrival and the anointing and the appointing of Saul the king next week. So next week, king named Saul. Okay, we have a couple of minutes. John, what?
I'm curious about something. We are today, worldwide, embroiled in a conflict in the Middle East between the Palestinians and the Israelites. Nowhere in either scripture or any other source, as far as I know, are there Palestinians named. And yet, the Palestinians claim, we were here long before you, Israel. You can't take this land and claim it for your own. If it's anybody's, it's ours. Were the Palestinians, Hittites, Amorites, Girgashites, whatever they were?
Yes.
Okay.
Very quick answer to that question. The question is, who are the Palestinians, where they come from? The term Palestine, as nearly as we can tell, is a regional name that was given to that area back in the Roman era. The way we talk about the Near East or the Southwest or the Northeast in the United States, it's a regional title, and the original people that lived there were all called generically Canaanites because the land was also called Canaan. Now, as time passed, that term Palestine was applied after World War I. In fact, it continued right on up through modern times. That region was still called Palestine, and the people living there certainly would be descendants, a mix of Arabs and Canaanites, the people, the Semites that had lived there originally. The Arabs are all descendants of, incidentally, Ishmael. They were down in the Arabian Peninsula. They conquered that region, intermarried. So what you have is a blend of Canaanite Arab people that are called Palestinians, meaning they're not Jews, they're not Israelites. And so that's our land. We were there before you guys came back. We were there before you guys even existed. That's basically the argument that they have. And it's difficult, but I saw one other, yes?
John, after Samson answers the riddle, he says to the
I was going to skip that because actually it's probably not what it means. What he said, if you look at the answer to the riddle, they say, what is stronger than a lion? What is sweeter than honey? In other words, they're answering the riddle by suggesting that there's something, by using lion and honey, but by saying what is stronger and sweeter, they are suggesting the wiles of a woman are stronger and sweeter than either of those. And they are telling him, this is a neat riddle in response to a riddle. It's very sophisticated. They're telling him, here's how we solved the riddle. Your wife told us. And what he's saying is, if you had not plowed with my heifer, meaning that if you had not been using my animals to plow your fields, I don't think it has the suggestion that it seems to have, but at any rate, he's saying that if you had not been influencing my wife, you wouldn't have gotten the answer, and that's why he left in a huff. So it's a very clever riddle in response to a riddle to let Samson know how they found out, because they're kind of rubbing it in is what they're doing. Kind of a fun story, actually. Thanks. I think I saw every biblical movie ever made. The very worst one was Salome, made with the redhead Rita Hayworth. She was in her 30s trying to make a movie comeback. It was the absolute worst Bible movie ever made. I loved it. I saw them all. So anyway, next week we'll pick up with a king named Saul. Thank you.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.